I'm here with Mr. Levinson, who's a Fullerton resident and a longtime community activist. And we've had some recent developments with the Fullerton City Council repealing an ordinance that Mr. Levinson and his wife basically brought to the table and had passed and has been on the books for a number of years. It has to do with sex offenders and their ability to circumvent other protections that are in place with respect to access to children, schools, parks, and the like. So I'd like to have Mr. Levinson discuss what has happened here recently at the past two city council meetings and where we stand right now and what's really going on with the children. Go ahead, Mr. Levinson.
Well, good evening. It's unfortunately another one of many sad days in Fullerton. February 7th, council meeting had on its agenda the repeal of Ordinance 3149, which is Fullerton Municipal Code 7.150, which was an ordinance that my wife and I brought to the fore back in 2010, and it was passed in September 21st, 2010. It was a simple ordinance. It was made to make up for the lack of a state law, Jessica's Law, that was passed in November 2006 by over 70% of the California population. That almost never happens on more than two to one. That's incredible. Over 7 out of 10 people voted for it. It was a law that dealt with residency restrictions for all sex offenders in the state of California with regard to how close they can live or reside by a park or school. And this law was passed, and unfortunately I came to find out back in 2010 that the law was unenforceable, basically, in terms of that residency restriction.
Now, when you say the law is unenforceable, that really doesn't make a lot of sense. Can you tell me what you mean by a law being unenforceable?
Well, for a law, and this is I found out from the Fullerton Police Department, but basically for a law to be enforceable, you have to have a statute stating what actually is the crime specifically, which it does. That's the good part of the law. But in order then to prosecute somebody, you have to have certain punishments assigned for that law. And the law, that proposition, never had any punishments assigned to it. So police officers basically cannot do anything, because if they would arrest somebody for breaking Jessica's Law, for failure to abide by the residency restrictions, they would have to let them go, because there's no way that the city or the DA could prosecute them, because there's absolutely no penalties, and therefore it's a moot point.
Okay, so let me get this straight. This was a ballot initiative taken up by, I would think, some well-intentioned people that probably had a child molested or harmed by a predator?
It was actually, it was taken up by a state assemblyman or senator up in the Lancaster area, and I'm trying to remember his name, but he was he was at the time a legislator, and I think he was frustrated with what he could get through the legislature, and he decided that this was important enough to bring it to the people, and that's what he did.
But he brought a law
to
the people that has no enforcement provisions.
Unfortunately, the way it was written, they failed to put any enforcement provisions, any penalties.
Now I've done some homework on this, and I was forced to go all the way to the state level, as you have, because the Fullerton Police Department is very evasive as to what can be done at the local level. And from what I've read that you've written, Mr. Levinson, you're absolutely correct that unless somebody is on parole or probation, this law has no teeth. There's no financial penalty associated with violating these residency restrictions under this law that was passed in 2010. And the only type of punishment that I'm aware of is jail time, only for a parole violation or probation violation. That's my understanding. So there's a large amount of sex offenders that are no longer on probation or on parole.
The majority of them, obviously.
Because of the time that has elapsed. So what you're telling me and the viewers is that this is called Jessica's Law, passed in 2010. by an overwhelming majority,
2006.
2006, by the overwhelming majority of the voters,
Right,
has no enforcement provisions
right,
when a sex offender is no longer on parole or probation.
right.
Now that is ridiculous.
Let me even clarify it further. When you make the exception, except if they're on parole or probation, that is only if the probation terms or the parole terms include that restriction. As far as I understand, that's on a case-by-case